Hello, and welcome to my review of the sixth studio album by Björk, Volta. This was the one that was requested most for me to review next. I have a very interesting relationship with this record. It was the last Björk record as I went through her discography and sort of heard all of her songs from her back catalog, because I didn't discover her until around 2010. I'm sorry, it's just the way it was. It was the last album that I finally heard full length before I was all caught up. And to me, it's an interesting place in her career. The promotion of this record was a little bit misleading to some people. The biggest sort of difference is that she's working with some more pop producers again, something that she hadn't done since debut or post. She works with Timbaland, who's done all these huge hits for Justin Timberlake, Madonna, Nelly Furtado. He's really hot at the moment. This is 2007. This album was released the 1st of May of 2007. And she also works with Danja, who's also a huge producer that Timbaland usually collaborates with. It was actually, they recorded about 7 songs together, and Timbaland has writing credits on 2 of them, and then he's helped producing on 2 of the other tracks. Apparently they recorded a lot of songs, but a lot of them didn't actually get on the finished record, and some of them were even supposed to be rumored to be collaborations that would be on his album, but that never happened. But the fact is when people heard this, they got those scratching their heads. Is Björk really going back to pop music? Björk also sort of described the album in initial lead up to being a more upbeat and a little bit more full on, as she describes it, like a little bit more energized. And I think that definitely led everyone to believe that, she's coming off of Medulla, which was the least pop thing she's ever done. And she's finally going back to embracing sort of more of that dance pop scene that made her so popular, especially in the UK in the 90s. Well, that's not entirely what this album ended up being, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I personally don't necessarily see Björk going as pop as she ever was on Björk in post or debut. That's as pop as she ever wanted to get, really. I mean, maybe she may release one song in an album in the future that might go back to that. She's never going to make an album that's fully just about pop music. And I think the elements that she brings from pop music, definitely influenced by Timbaland on this record, are subtle enough that still keep it avant-garde and interesting and unique. The flavor and sound, there's a lot of horns. There's a brass band that she kind of got together for this album. It's very energized. It's very raw. The name for this album is inspired by several things, actually. Volta is the name of a river in Africa, which was actually man-made. If you've heard of Burkina Faso and Ghana, they're 2 countries in Midwestern Africa. Well, they actually used to be known as Upper and Lower Volta, because the Volta rivers goes through those countries. So it's the name of a river in Africa. She was inspired by that because this album is about journey and it's about exploration. There's also the name of an Italian scientist who came up with the battery. So that ties into the energy factor. And then it's also this name of this dance that she was intrigued by, which is very hard to do. It's this dance from the Renaissance era, an Italian dance. It kind of means to turn. So all these things, she thought, great, that's a great title for this record. All of her albums are characters. I love the colorful nature of this album, and some of the album artwork she's dressed in all of these sort of tribal kind of traditional woven fabrics, and she's, throwing fire, and she's in this sort of volcanic landscape. So Fire Dancers was obviously an inspiration for the theme of this album and the energy of it. And then the album cover, which was directed by Nick Knight, she's sort of in this capsule, this costume. I've heard people say it's her ugliest album cover. I think all of her album covers are so interesting and unique, and I don't deem any of them as ugly. I don't necessarily think of one as necessarily light years above the others. I think they all represent the theme and energy of the album so beautifully. I do get some influences of Eastern culture on this album for sure. And I think the dress and the sort of weird chicken costume, some people called it, it has some vague Chinese influence to me. And I don't know, I just get a little bit of that. Okay, so like I said, this isn't my favorite album of Björk's. It's unfortunately, if I look at all of her discography, this album isn't nearly as eye-grabbing or something I come back to as often. It definitely isn't, you know, don't get me wrong, when I say it's one of my least favorites, it doesn't mean that I don't like this record. I love Björk's music, I love all of her albums, but if I had to rank this album, it wouldn't necessarily be towards the top of the list. But that's just because, you know, there's just so much great stuff that she does, and I feel like some of the harsher sounds are a little bit abrasive, and not as necessarily like it puts me off completely, but it's not, you know, it's not Vespertine for me, you know, which is just so much more lush and melodic. This album definitely has some standouts, and it kind of goes in a lot of different directions. The lead single, Earth Intruders, which was co-produced by Timbaland and Danja, as well as Björk herself. This song was the perfect sort of intro to this album because it influences a little bit more of that sort of ritualistic dance sound with that, you know, you can definitely hear that this is a Timbaland produced song. It actually performed pretty well in terms of the Billboard one. It debuted at number 84 in the US Billboard Hot 100, which is the highest spot that she had ever gotten since Big Time Sensuality off of her debut album. You know, the Timbaland carries that a bit. So it's danceable, it's fully embodied in that sound, and it's a very strong environmental theme to a lot of this record. And there's also a little bit of an anthropological approach. This album is a little bit about, you know, people and social structures of them. And she embodies and, you know, understands that as describing, we are the earth intruders. Muddy with twigs and branches, turmoil, carnage. I love how she says those words, and just this sort of very heavy metal, sort of dire. She even throws in the word voodoo, which she was kind of inspired by. She says necessary voodoo. Just, I mean, a little bit offbeat from the rest of, you know, the theme of this record. What does voodoo have to do with the idea of an earth intruder? But there is the idea of puppetry, of humans being controlled, being slaves to just dominating the world. I guess that kind of ties in. But she really goes into darker territory when she sings mud graves, timber, morbid trenches. So there's an element of the warfare, the construction that destroys the environment, you know, deforestation, you know, agriculture, all of these things that harm the environment she's hinting at. And so, you know, again, this is a bit of a dire apocalyptic song. The music video is sort of this silhouetted, sort of animated version of these people marching, and she sings, you know, march at the end. That's kind of the outro of the song. And then there's her eyes just sort of above, and she's sort of like, it reminds me of that little baby from the Teletubbies. I don't know why, but when I first saw the video, that's just what instantly came to mind. This song outros then into this beautiful, lush forest soundscape, where you also then vaguely hear this foghorn and these sort of boats on a harbor, which then you can definitely tell this is inspired by the Reykjavik harbors. Even though it first makes you think you might be in some tropical jungle area, she then kind of uses that atmospheric recording of daily sounds. And I just love the sounds of like the boats on the harbor, and you hear a match being struck. You just hear, it's like something's about, like a journey is about to begin. The boat is signaling that it's about to depart from the harbor. You get that feel. And so then we seek into Wanderlust, which is my favorite song on this album. And Björk has said that this is sort of the central song that the album sort of revolves around. The theme of this song is constantly searching, constantly traveling, endlessly onward to find somewhere. You know, this reminds me of like the Polynesian voyagers, you know, who kept sailing from island to island. I am leaving this harbor, giving urban a farewell, leaving the city. I feel you, girl. I definitely needed to do that. Its habitants seem too keen on God. I cannot stomach their rights and wrongs. So there's a lot of this sort of ethical questioning about what this sort of structured society we built around ourselves is based on. Is it really right and wrong, or is this society actually, you know, completely distorted? I have lost my origin, and I don't want to find it again. Whether sailing into nature's laws and be held by ocean's pause. Wanderlust, relentlessly craving, peel off the layers until we get to the core. The music video is one of the most unique, atmospheric, unique themed music videos of Björk's career. It shows her, and this, again, this feels Chinese aesthetic from the music and imagery. I guess there's a little bit of Buddhist symbolism always kind of embraced around this, you know, how she has that shadow self of hers on her shoulders. This music video was filmed with the use of a lot of puppets, which I think is really cool. some actual live action sequences, CGI, of course, and then the use of miniature models. It took 9 months to film this music video. I mean, it was all these custom sets that had to be built. I think it's the one music video that so much went into it. It was like a little film. And then you get that Mongolian aesthetic. She's dressed in traditional Mongolian attire, and there are these yaks, or these, they're kind of like Mongolian bison that are, very symbolic in Mongolian and Turkic countries' culture. And so she leads the herd of these yaks down this river that she sort of forms. And there's these hands that come and form the river and cause it to go in different directions. But yeah, on her backpack, there's this sort of shadow self that at one point there's this really intense fight sequence. And so at the end, they finally all kind of fall into the mouth of this giant, like very, again, it looks very Tibetan, Chinese, Mongolian. I get some of those really strong cultural aesthetics tied in. And they fall off this waterfall and into the oblivion. I mean, it's just so unique. If you haven't seen this music video, it's so arresting, and the cultural significance of it. There's this idea of karma, karma being represented by the creature on her back that's holding her back, that she's fighting with, of her past, reconciling that, understanding destiny and moving forward, and understanding how the world was created. I mean, there's some very vague spiritual overtones to this that, again, I think harken to somewhat more of the Buddhist idea of Mahayana Buddhism, which is large vehicle Buddhism, that everyone can achieve enlightenment by reconciling their own, which, worships a little bit more like icons and Buddhas, and the imagery just feels so Tibetan. So it really harks to that sort of religious aesthetic. The Dull Flame of Desire, which features vocalist, he's previously known as Anthony Haggerty, but now she is known as Anoni. She is transgender as of recently. She was a collaborator with Björk on this song, and they both have very unique voices that I think blend really well together. They also collaborated on Volna Cura, which I thought was really interesting. This was a big duet song for them, and this song contains lyrics from a poem by Fyodor Chuchev, and it was then used as to inspire the lyrics of this song. Through the downcast lashes, I see the dull flame of desire. This song sonically uses the horns the most, and I think it has that epic anthemic feel, but the problem is I feel like this song just drags on for far too long. The melody kind of just repeats itself, and it's sort of just Björk and Anoni kind of going back and forth over and over again, and they sort of just draw out the through the downcast lashes, I see the dull flame of desire longer and longer. I find myself really wishing the song was about 2 or 3 minutes shorter. It's probably my least favorite song on the album for that. I love the melody, and the intro is so strong with the horns, and there is so much emotion to it, but it just drags on and on. And I don't know, maybe it's not the melody starts to break down towards the end, and they start to do all these different vocal things, which is interesting, but at that point it gets a little repetitive and a little bit beaten to the ground, in my opinion. So then we come to the other Timbaland produced song along with Danja on this album, Innocence, which was technically like the second single off of this album. This is probably one of the most electronic dance songs that Björk's done in her recent career. It's very empowering. It speaks to, overcoming, when you're young, it speaks to that sort of youthful, carefree nature where you don't overthink things so much, that when you get older, you spend so much time like being a little bit more cautious and methodical with your approach of things. And I once had no fears, none at all. And then when I had some, to my surprise, I grew to like both. Scared or brave without them. The beat in the background is just like it's the most punching hard beat, I mean, it reminds me of like I Miss You off of Post. It's feverish in that respect. It doesn't let up, and it really punctuates, each hard hounding pound of this drum-like beat just carries the rhythm of this, which I think is inspired by some of these sort of more tribal, sort of grunting kind of dances. I See Who You Are is probably my second favorite song on this album because it is more of a ballad, and it's a little bit more lush in its sound. It's going a little bit more back to things that I liked from Vespertine. It's a very, celebratory song of life and living and love and understanding each other's true nature. I think that Björk was inspired a lot by her daughter when she was writing this, seeing her now and falling in love with just this person that will always be so important to her, no matter what age she is or what she may do with her life. You know, she will always unconditionally love her. She knows who she really is. I see who you are behind the skin and the muscles. She really takes her time with pronouncing these words in that sort of very kind of almost erotic sort of way that Björk does, where she really overpronounces things and that Icelandic accent comes through really strong. I will see the same girl, the same soul, lioness, fireheart. There are some really Eastern traditional instruments used to sort of amplify the tension and emotion in these drawn out silences between lyrics that really harkens to like traditional Japanese and Chinese music, which makes this song, it always thinks of me of being like in a Chinese garden with bamboo. And afterwards, later this century, when you and I have become corpses, let's celebrate now all this flesh on our bones. Let me push you up against me tightly and enjoy every bit of you. So you can see the mother-daughter love coming through. And again, the beat then becomes this Eastern-inspired sound that carries this into Chinese-sounding song, and I love that. So the next song, Vertebrae by Vertebrae, is probably one of the most rambunctious and sort of heavy metal songs on this album. It's very heavy, and it's a little bit plodding to that regard, and it's definitely not my favorite because of that, although I do appreciate the raw energy and emotion that's focused in this song. There's a lot of pent-up frustration. She's basically alluding to, you know, the Homo sapien or the Homo erectus. She sings straight and erect, hungry and curious, up on the toe, looking forward, you know, the vertebrae, the spine, Homo sapiens, you know, coming to walk and to explore more and become more hungry. She came here to lose face, get down on her knees, the beast is back. And she sings that so primally. So she's showing this through herself, but also through humanity. She's sort of using that as two sort of metaphors in one, how the self can overcome each other and become very primal. And we all have these primal nature needs. Nature comes from, you know, we're all a part of nature. We're all, you know, a little bit tainted by it. We all have these primal urges. I have been filled with steam for months, for years. Same old cloud, claustrophobic me. Let it burst like old train sounds. Make them leave me nature. Make it burst like old train sounds. I thought that was just such a funny Björk lyric because, you know, it's like that industrial clamor that she's speaking of, this like cathartic need to release all this energy. And so it beautifully segues into another song I think that is a very strong highlight, but one of those melancholic songs on the album and in Björk's career, Pneumonia, which I think she was inspired by when she actually had pneumonia and she felt super isolated from the world. And interestingly enough, she was also inspired by one of my favorite fantasy horror films, Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth, which came out in 2006. Get over the sorrow, girl. The world is always going to be made of this. You can trust in it, unless you breathe in bravely. And your lungs, they're mourning TB style. I always read that as teepee style, which I thought was really interesting because it's sort of like a teepee. They're collapsed in themselves in a central point. So I always thought of lungs being collapsed teepee style as a lot more interesting. I don't really understand the TB style. All the stillborn love that could have happened, all the moments you could have embraced, all the moments you should have not locked up. So I always view this song as me reflecting on all those times when I felt like I was too shy and not really courageous enough. We all kind of second guess ourselves. To understand, to shut yourself up would be the hugest crime of them all. You know, it's so beautiful to be on your own and to embrace and wallow in the sorrow, but ultimately you need to get over it. And she sings that kind of, get over it, girl. Get, you know, it's just so important to take this experience and only make you stronger. And I love the sort of rain that's just heard in the distance of this because it echoes that sort of rainy day, feeling shut in, and, you know, or like this primal beast from Vertebrae by Vertebrae running in after all this energy and going into a cave as the storm passes and feeling all of a sudden very introspective. I always kind of tie those narratives together. So Hope has always been one of those more enigmatic songs for me. I've never really understood the meaning of it. It has this very, again, tribal and also a little bit more Eastern sound to it. Also, Timbaland helped write this song as well, along with her. The instrument of the kora is this West African harp that's used, that kind of creates that sort of energetic harp sound. Beyond sort of the cultural aesthetic I get from this song, and I do have it understanding it's sort of this existential crisis, of what's right and what's wrong, really, what's the lesser of two evils. This song was inspired by this story of this suicide bomber who was pregnant, but the media assumed that she was just pretending. When they discovered she actually was, they suddenly changed the story and were so much more compassionate for her, because that must have come off as such a huge sacrifice to not only sacrifice herself, but her own baby. I was trying to research this, but there are so many stories of suicide bombers that are pregnant that I couldn't find one that would have linked to that time period, and that Björk would have seen that and been inspired by it. So I don't know where this took place. I kind of assume the Middle East, but it could be in Africa. A lot of these places, that actually happens quite common. It's a tragedy, and she's sort of just reflecting on, where does the compassion for life really come from? The innocence of a child who's also killed by this act. What's the lesser of two evils? If she kills them or dies in vain, which is worse? I think it's a bit of a rhetorical, like, I can't really answer this philosophical kind of question of, like, to kill one to save many, or what's better or worse. There's a lot of these themes tied together. It's just strange inspiration for a song like this. It's very overt, and it doesn't shroud this in metaphors. I mean, this is what the song is about, the specific story she read in the news. Then we come to Declare Independence, the most bombastic and hard-hitting, edgy punk song on this record. This is Björk's inner punk from Iceland coming out and saying, declare independence, don't let them do this to you, raise your flag, start your own currency. This song is dedicated to the Faroe Islands and to somewhat as well of Greenland, which we know is technically under Danish control. They're not their own entity, although there's a lot of autonomy given to those places. I must admit, I would love to see the Faroe Islands be independent. They're slightly south of Iceland. They have their own culture, which is very much more similar to Icelandic, and it's nothing like Danish. But, the Danish used to colonize all these places. They once colonized Iceland themselves. So there's a strong independent movement for this song. She's used this to dedicate to so many independence movements all over the world, even recently with the Catalonia. She even, I think she posted this video on Facebook and said, declare independence for Catalonia. She also talked about Kosovo, and she got in trouble. She kind of got disinvited to perform in Serbia when she started making this song about Kosovo. And more controversially, in March of 2008, she shouted Tibet after she sang this song in Shanghai, in China. And everyone didn't know what to do. They were just like, this is not right. They all just sort of left. It was very kind of awkward. And she basically got banned from China. She can no longer perform. She was deemed a political controversial figure. And don't worry, a lot of people have been banned from China. Lady Gaga has been banned from performing in China. U2, a ton of big artists have been banned. So it was just, comes with the territory. Again, I think Tibet should be freed as well. I think the things that Chinese people have done to Tibet are horrible. But the Chinese people don't view it that way. Same with Taiwan. Like, let Taiwan go. Seriously. Anyway. But the music video is so interesting. She finally teams up with Michael Gondry, someone she hasn't worked with since the 90s. They are a dream team together when they're coming up with music videos. The megaphone that Björk has is she's sort of shouting into these sort of like robot-like figures who are all tied up in this sort of loom, and sort of there's a marching beat to this song, and so the loom kind of matches the beat, and then all these colors come in, and it gets more frantic and hectic as she gets more, the drama becomes more heightened, and it kind of all just breaks down beautifully into this very punk kind of heavy metal sort of electronic fest. And this song just has so much energy, and I think it's one of the most clear-cutting and like direct songs Björk's ever done, where and this does kind of harken back to some of her songs from the 90s, because it does have that strong political pop sensibility that is very, grounded and very firm, similar to songs like Army of Me with that punk edge. And I think it's one of her standout songs. It's really fun. It's just, you can't help but feel some real power from it. We end the album with My Juvenile. So Björk has a son named Sindri, who she actually had in like the late 80s, early 90s. And so by this point, he was like, he was like a teenager. And so, her relationship with him is kind of interesting, because of course the marriage she had with his father fell apart really quickly. And so she sings about how now they've become distant and she wants to rekindle their, closeness again. Now that she sees him older, she kind of wants to redress anything that she might have felt like she let him go too easily or something. Anthony Hegarty, again, Anoni now, is featured again on this song. So they go back and forth over a clavichord. Being a parent, you constantly go through this struggle of wanting your kids to have a lot of independence and wanting them like, suddenly like they're 8 years old and you just want to hold them close and never let them go. It's that push and pull. So she's sort of, as a mother, kind of understanding this now. She's like, oh my God, like one day I want him right next to me. The other, I want him to go and live his own life. This sort of confusing relationship. So it kind of just, calmly sort of ends the album with this sort of introspective reflection on that. And so the album in general, it definitely goes from like very high energy to a little bit more calm and a little bit more serene and Eastern influenced, with all the unique instruments that are used. Like I said, the clavichord, the kora, some of these very interesting Chinese instruments. And then, of course, Timbaland's production, or the production of Mark Bell, or who helped produce Declare Independence. This album does kind of tell a story of humanity and that sort of groundedness of it, and then like understanding humanity's motives for doing things, whether it's environmental concerns or political concerns. This album is political, and it's highly charged, and it's grounded in like history, but also in the current moment and state of affairs of the world. And so it makes it a very on-earth record. Björk definitely kind of goes back and forth between making albums that are a little bit more esoteric and albums that are a little bit more grounded in, relationship and socio-political structures that are, very earth-centered. And so I find this album very intriguing. I think it deals with some really interesting psychological, themes that she doesn't explore so much sometimes in other records so overtly. And it asks some really deep and dark questions about human existence and human nature. And so that tribal feel will always make this album its unique kind of dancey, kind of in-your-face punk character that also is super zen and also very Buddhist-like. So I find it just a very unique record. Let me know in the comments what you think about it. I hope I did it justice. I actually had a lot of trouble kind of coming up with what to say about this album because I knew it wasn't my absolute favorite and I hadn't listened to it that much and in recent years. And I just wanted to sort of do it justice because I know that there was a lot of thought put into it and a lot of the songs had a lot of meaning that was very personal to Björk, but also to a certain situation. And there's always more things to be interpreted by all these songs. So I'm probably missing half the story. So let me know what you think. And I'm very excited. I will be reviewing Utopia because obviously that comes out in less than 1 week now. Probably next weekend. We'll see how soon I can get it up. I mean, it could be as late as next Monday because it's really hard for me to necessarily, and I don't want to record it too soon after the album comes out, but I am very excited for Utopia. I do think Utopia is not going to be a lot like Volta, but there might be flavors of it. All of her albums just bring something different to the table, and I always love that about them. So I hope you enjoyed this review. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day. Bye.